The Reverend's voice was the only sound in the room. "Do you take this woman to be your lawful wife?" Caleb Reeves did not look at the window, did not look at the door still swinging faintly on its hinge from the cold outside, did not look at anything but the top button of his own collar, too tight, choking him a little, the way most things had felt too tight since Mary died. "I do," he said. Flat, 2 words laid down like a man setting a plank across a gap in a floor, not because he wanted to cross it yet, but because the house needed the floor whole again. Beside him, a woman he had known for 11 days stood with her chin lifted and her hands folded so tightly the knuckles had gone pale, and when the Reverend asked her the same question, she answered without a tremor in her voice at all, though her hands betrayed her. Upstairs, unseen by either of them, a girl of 7 sat on the top step in her nightgown, with her knees pulled to her chest, listening to her father marry a stranger, and she did not cry, because she had already decided, in the private ruthless logic of children, that crying would not stop it. And stopping it was not in fact what she wanted. What she wanted was for the house to stop being so quiet. This is not where the story begins. It is only where it turns. 3 weeks before that morning, the Reeves Ranch sat at the base of a long red ridge in the Wyoming Territory, and it was, by any measure a stranger might apply, a good and prosperous piece of land. Good water, good grass. A house Caleb's own father had built with square-hewn timber that had not warped in 20 years. But a house is not measured only in timber. Since Mary had died bringing Nell's baby brother into the world 2 winters past, and the brother had not lived past that first terrible night, the Reeves house had gone quiet in the particular way that only a house that once held laughter can go quiet. The clock still ticked, the stove still drew. But no one sang while the bread rose anymore, and no one called out from one room to another just to hear the answer come back, and Caleb had stopped noticing the quiet the way a man stops noticing his own limp, until it became simply the shape of how he walked. He rose before light and worked until after dark, not because the ranch demanded it, though it did, but because work was the only room in his day where grief did not follow him in and sit down across the table. He mended fences that did not strictly need mending. He rode the far pasture twice when once would do. Nell grew up fast and small in that quiet, dressing herself, plaiting her own hair badly, learning to read the silences of a father who loved her without knowing any more how to say so out loud, and Hattie Boone, who had kept the Reeves house since before Caleb was born, and had loved Mary like a daughter of her own blood. Watched the 2 of them move through the rooms like ghosts who had not yet noticed they were haunting something. Hattie said nothing for a long while, because grief has its own season, and a wise woman does not rush it. She had buried her own husband a decade back, and she understood better than most that a person cannot be argued out of sorrow, only waited out with patience and hot food and the stubborn refusal to leave them alone in it. But there came a night in early autumn when Nell would not eat, pushing the beans around her plate in slow, listless circles, and would not speak, and finally, pressed by Hattie's gentle stubbornness, said only, "It's too quiet, Hattie. I don't like how quiet it is." And something in the flatness of the child's voice frightened the old woman more than tears would have. Hattie carried that sentence to Caleb the way another woman might carry a doctor's diagnosis, plain and without softening, standing in the barn doorway while he worked a cinch strap that did not need working, and she said, "That girl is starving for something food won't fix, Caleb Reeves, and you are the only one who can set a place for it." Something in him that had been holding steady for 2 years finally gave, not all at once, but enough. He rode to town the next morning and paid for an advertisement in 3 newspapers east of the territory line, and he wrote it himself, crossing out 4 drafts before he let the 5th stand: rancher, widower, 1 daughter, seeks wife. Practical arrangement preferred. must be willing to work. He did not write anything about love, because he did not believe at that time that love was a thing a man got twice in one life, and he was not looking for it. He was looking only to stop the house from going quiet. The woman who answered was named Rose Hale, and she came west on a coach that smelled of dust and other people's sweat, with a single trunk and a reputation that had somehow, in the way of small towns, arrived a full day ahead of her. By the time she stepped down into the street, 2 women outside the mercantile were already trading looks over the tops of their baskets, and a boy delivering feed said loud enough to be heard that he'd heard she'd left Ohio under a cloud, and Rose heard every word of it and let none of it touch her face. She had practiced that stillness the way another woman practices piano, out of necessity rather than pleasure, and it had cost her plenty to learn it. She was not, in truth, running toward a rancher's advertisement so much as she was running away from a town that had decided, on the word of one angry man, that she was a thief, and she had let them decide it, because the alternative was worse than a stolen reputation. She had a sister back in Ohio named Clara, and Clara had a husband named Jacob Vance, and there were things about that marriage that Rose had seen with her own eyes. Bruises explained away too smoothly. A fear in her sister's voice that had not been there before the wedding, that Rose had never once spoken of to another living soul, not even under accusation, not even when the money went missing and every eye in town turned to her. She had taken the blame the way a person steps in front of a blow meant for someone weaker, and then she had answered a stranger's advertisement in a territory newspaper and bought a coach ticket with the last of what she had. And she told herself, watching the planes roll by the window hour after hour until the green of Ohio gave way to the endless pale grass of the territory, that a fresh start did not require her to explain the old one. She stepped off that coach, a stranger twice over, a stranger to the town, and a stranger to the truth she carried folded up small inside her, the way another woman might carry a photograph she was not ready to show anyone. The wedding, when it came, was exactly what the advertisement had promised, and nothing more. There was no courtship in it, no soft looking across the table, only 2 adults sitting in Caleb's front room on the evening Rose arrived, speaking plainly about what each of them needed and what each of them could offer, the way 2 ranchers might discuss a fair trade of cattle for seed. "I won't lie to you about what this is," Caleb said, turning his hat over in his hands. "I buried my wife 2 years back. I've got a daughter who needs raising and a house that needs running, and I haven't got the first idea how to give either one what they're owed, working it alone." Rose had listened with her back straight and her eyes steady on his. "I'm not looking for romance, Mr. Reeves," she answered. "I'm looking for a roof and work and a name people won't whisper about behind their hands. If you can offer the first 2, I expect I can earn the third myself." Hattie sat in the corner through that whole conversation with her sewing in her lap and said not one word, though her needle went still more than once. She did not trust easily anymore. She had buried a husband and outlived 2 hired hands who had promised to stay through hard winters and hadn't, and she had watched Caleb bury a wife, and she had come, in her old age, to believe that promises made quickly were rarely promises kept. But she said nothing that night, because it was not her house to speak for. Not yet. And the wedding took place 3 days later in the front room, with the Reverend and Hattie as witnesses and Nell watching from the stairs. And that is the morning where this story began. The first weeks were quiet in a new way, not the hollow quiet of a grieving house, but the careful quiet of 2 strangers learning where the floorboards creaked and which doors stuck in damp weather. Rose rose before Caleb most mornings, which surprised him, since he had assumed a woman raised in a town would keep town hours. She had the stove going and coffee poured before he came down, and she did it without being asked, the way a person does a thing they have simply always done. She surprised him again within the first week, when a fence post came up rotted through, and she did not wait for him to notice it himself, but had already replaced it by the time he rode past that pasture, her sleeves rolled, and a hammer in a hand that clearly was not new to a hammer. "My father raised 3 daughters and no sons," she told him when he asked where she'd learned it. Not looking up from the post she was tamping into place. Somebody had to learn to swing a hammer, and it might as well have been all of us. She surprised him a third time when Nell came home from the schoolhouse with a torn dress and tears already threatening, and Rose sat the girl down at the kitchen table not to comfort her first, but to teach her, right there, how to mend the tear herself. Small stitches, patient hands over small hands, so that by the time the dress was whole again, so, a little, was the morning. And Nell held up the mended hem afterward, with a fierce, surprised pride that Caleb had not seen on his daughter's face in longer than he wanted to admit. She surprised him a 4th time and a 5th, and then Caleb simply stopped counting, because it seemed the surprises were not going to stop. She could read Latin, taught to her by a father who had once hoped for better than a rancher's territory for his daughters, and she read to Nell some evenings from a small worn book of old stories, translating as she went, her voice dropping into something almost musical. She could set a broken wing on a hawk Nell found in the yard, splinting it with a calm, sure patience that had the bird flying again inside a month. And when Caleb asked where a boarding house girl had learned doctoring, she only said, "Where I grew up, you learned to mend whatever came to your door needing mending, feathered or not." And something in the way she said it made him wonder, not for the first time, how much of her old life she was choosing not to tell him. She knew, from a mother long dead, how to make bread rise in a house too cold for yeast to want to work, coaxing it near the stove with a patience Caleb did not have for much of anything since Mary passed. And the first time the whole house filled with the smell of baking bread again, he stood in the kitchen doorway a long moment before he could make himself walk on through it, because that smell alone undid something in his chest he had thought was done being undone. Every week brought some new, quiet proof that the woman who had answered a practical advertisement was not, in fact, a simple or practical creature at all, but someone who had folded a great many selves down small to fit inside the shape a hard life had left available to her. Caleb began to notice these things the way a man notices weather changing, not all at once, but gradually, until one evening he realized he had been standing in the barn doorway for several minutes, simply watching her teach Nell to whistle through a blade of grass, both of them laughing at the terrible squawking sounds that came out before either managed a true note. And he did not know how long he had been standing there before he noticed himself doing it, or how long it had been since the sound of his daughter's laughter had stopped him cold in a doorway like that. There was a night in that same stretch of weeks when Caleb came in late from checking a heifer close to calving and found the kitchen lamp still burning long past the hour Rose usually banked the fire and went up. He found her at the table with a ledger open in front of her, his ledger, the one he kept the ranch accounts in, and for one cold instant something old and suspicious rose in him before he saw what she was actually doing, not prying, but correcting. A column of figures re-added in a small, careful hand beside his own larger one. A note in the margin that read, simply, "This comes out different if you carry the two." He had been keeping that ledger wrong for the better part of a year, grief making him careless with numbers the way it made him careless with most things, and he stood in the doorway a long moment, feeling something complicated move through him. Not quite embarrassment, and not quite gratitude, but some new country between the two. "You didn't have to do that tonight," he said, and Rose looked up, without apology, in her face. "I couldn't sleep for thinking about it once I'd noticed. Figures nag at me the way some people get nagged by an unlatched gate." He sat down across from her then, for the first time since the wedding, not because the ledger required 2 sets of hands, but because he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he did not want to go up to bed yet. And they worked the accounts together by lamplight until well past midnight, and it was, though neither of them called it so at the time, the first evening that had felt like something other than an arrangement. Nell tested her new mother the way children test new ground, carefully, and then all at once. There was an afternoon in that same season when the girl came home in a fury over a boy at the schoolhouse who had teased her for her mother being dead, and Rose, rather than telling her the easy comforting lies a stranger might reach for, sat with her out by the corral fence and said only, "He said an unkind thing because he doesn't know what to do with the size of what you're carrying, and neither, some days, do you. That doesn't make it fair. It only makes it human." Nell had cried then, hard, the way she had not let herself cry in the 2 years since her mother and brother died, and Rose had not rushed her out of it or hushed her too quickly, only sat beside her with a steady hand on her back until the worst of it passed, and afterward taught her because Nell asked how to throw a proper punch with her thumb outside her fist so she wouldn't break it if that boy ever needed teaching a second time. Caleb, coming around the barn in time to catch the tail end of that lesson, had to turn away to hide the sound that came out of him, which was somewhere between a laugh and something a great deal softer. It was Hattie who sat Rose down one evening in late October, once the first frost had silvered the pasture grass, and the wind had turned that particular sharp direction that meant winter was done waiting politely, and told her plainly what she needed to say. "I've seen women come through that door before," Hattie said, not unkindly, her hands still working a mending pile even as she spoke, the needle flashing steady in the lamplight. "And I've seen most of them leave again once the first hard season showed its teeth. There was a hired girl here, years back, swore up and down she'd stay through the worst of it, and she was gone before the first real snow. Left a note on the table like that settled anything. I want to know if you're the kind that stays when it isn't easy, or the kind that only stays when it is." Rose did not answer quickly, because she had learned the value of not answering quickly, turning the question over the way she turned over most things people asked her, weighing what was safe to say against what was true. But when she did answer, she said only, "I have already lost the easy version of my life, Mrs. Boone, whatever brought me west, it wasn't a taste for comfort. I am not looking for another comfortable life to lose." Hattie studied her a long moment over the mending, the way a woman studies a horse she is not yet sure she can trust to carry a child. And then she said the thing she had said once before, years ago, to that same hired girl who had not lasted the winter. "You can graft a new branch onto an old tree, but only if the tree still wants to live." This house wanted to die a little after Mary. "I need to know you're not going to be the reason it finishes the job." It was not a warm thing to say, but it was an honest one, and Rose understood honesty better than warmth, and she nodded once, slow, and something between the two women settled that had not been settled before. Not friendship exactly, not yet, but a kind of provisional respect that both of them understood might, given time and hard seasons enough, become something more. The outside pressure came the way it always comes in small places, quietly first, and then all at once. Mrs. Colby at the Mercantile had a cousin who had written from Ohio with news of a Hale girl who'd run off owing money to half the town, and once that letter made its rounds among the church ladies and the wives who gathered at the well. Rose could not walk into the store without feeling the room's temperature drop a few degrees, without the particular silence that falls when everyone stops talking at once and pretends they hadn't been. Children she passed on the road no longer waved. A neighboring rancher named Warren Doyle, who had wanted Reeves' water rights for 2 years and had been rebuffed twice by Caleb, saw an opportunity in the gossip and began dropping by with unnecessary regularity, offering sympathy that was really just a wedge, murmuring to Caleb over fence posts that a man ought to know what he'd married before he staked his daughter's future on it. "I don't say it to wound you, Reeves," Doyle told him one gray afternoon, leaning easy against the rail as if he had all the time in creation. "Only that a man in your position, with a girl to raise, can't afford the kind of trouble a woman like that tends to carry with her. Now, if the western pasture were to change hands, you'd have coin enough to start fresh, clean, no complications." Caleb said nothing to that but turned and walked back toward the house, and Doyle watched him go with the patient look of a man who believed pressure only needed time to work. There was a morning in the thick of it, when Rose could not avoid the mercantile any longer, the pantry down to its last sack of flour, and she walked in with her basket over her arm and her back straight. And Mrs. Colby did not so much as look up from behind the counter until Rose set her list down, and then the woman said, loud enough for the two other customers to hear plainly, "Funny thing, the things that follow a person west. You'd think a fresh start would stay fresh." Rose set her coin on the counter without flinching. "You'd think," she agreed, "that a woman raised right would know better than to repeat a stranger's letter as gospel. But I suppose that's a fresher start than most of us get, Mrs. Colby, the chance to decide every single day whether we're going to be kind or not, and choosing wrong anyway." She took her flour and walked out with her chin level, and it was only once she was back on the wagon seat, the store well behind her, that her hands began to shake against the reins, and she sat a full minute in the cold before she trusted herself to drive on. Rose bore the town's coldness the way she had learned to bear all such things, with a straight back and a closed face, but it cost her. And Hattie saw the cost even if Caleb, still learning to read his new wife, did not see it right away. Saw it in the way Rose stopped volunteering to go into town for supplies, in the way her shoulders came up an inch higher whenever a wagon passed on the road. It was Nell, in the end, who forced the matter into the open. She came home from the schoolhouse one afternoon with her fists balled and her lips split, and told her father, flat out, that a boy had called her new mother a thief in front of the whole yard, and she had hit him for it, and she was not sorry, and she would do it again. Caleb knelt down and looked at his daughter's split lip a long moment, and something in his face went very still and very quiet. And he said, "You won't need to do it again," and rode into town that same evening. He walked into the mercantile, where Mrs. Colby stood behind her counter and 3 other customers turned to watch, and he said, in a voice that did not rise but carried anyway, that the next person who spread rumor about his wife under his roof's good name would answer to him directly, that he had married her with his eyes open and his name freely given, and that anyone with a grievance against Rose Reeves could bring it to him first, in the daylight, rather than trade it in whispers behind a woman's back. He said it quiet, the way Hattie's warnings had been quiet, and it landed harder for the quiet. And Mrs. Colby's face went the color of raw dough, and she found, in the weeks that followed, considerably less to say. The true danger arrived on a Thursday in November, with the sky low and gray and threatening its first real snow, when a man Rose had hoped never to see again rode up the lane on a horse lathered from hard travel, its sides heaving, its eyes wild with having been pushed too far too fast. Jacob Vance had followed the trail of rumor and coach schedules across 2 territories, not because he wanted Rose back in Ohio, but because he wanted the silence she had bought with her reputation to stay bought, and something, a letter from Clara that he'd intercepted and read with growing fury, a fear that his wife's sister might one day speak the truth of what happened in that house, had driven him west to make certain of it. He found Rose in the yard hanging wash and did not waste time on pleasantries. "You'll come back and set the record straight the way it ought to be set," he told her, low enough that Nell, watching from the porch with a book forgotten in her lap, could not hear the words, but could see the shape of the threat in the man's shoulders, the way he crowded too close. Clara's been writing letters she's got no business writing, and you're going to tell her to stop, or I'll make certain this whole county knows exactly what kind of woman they've let into their homes. Rose did not move, though every instinct in her wanted to step back. Say what you came to say, Jacob, she answered, and her voice did not shake, though her hands, out of his sight, had curled into fists in the folds of her apron. And then get off this land before my husband finds you standing on it. What happened next happened fast, the way real danger always does. Caleb came around the corner of the barn at the sound of raised voices, took one look at the stranger crowding his wife, and closed the distance between them in a handful of long strides. Words were exchanged, hard ones, and then hands, and in the scuffle that followed a lantern hanging from a post hook was knocked loose and shattered against the barn wall, and the dry straw banked along the floor caught faster than any of them could account for, flame climbing the old timber with a hungry, crackling speed that turned the whole structure orange within minutes. Smoke rolled thick and black across the yard. Somewhere in the chaos and the shouting, no one could account for Nell, who had bolted for the barn instead of away from it, because her rabbit, her one soft comfort in a hard year, was caged in the back stall, and children do not weigh danger the way grown people do when something they love is on the other side of it. Rose did not think. She was through the barn door and into smoke thick enough to blind a person before Caleb had even registered she was gone, calling the girl's name into the roaring dark, dropping low where the air still held a little clean beneath the smoke, the way her father had once taught her in a burning grain shed a lifetime ago. She found Nell coughing and pinned by a fallen beam across the stall door. The rabbit cage clutched against her chest even as she struggled, and Rose got the girl free with strength she did not know she had left in her, hauling the beam aside with her bare hands, and dragged her out through a wall of heat that took the skin off Rose's forearm in one long searing line and singed the hem of her dress to black lace before Caleb, half blind himself from smoke, found them both and pulled them clear into the frost-hard yard. Vance already fled into the dark on his lathered horse rather than face what he had started. The fire finally beaten down by bucket lines and desperate neighboring hands. Doyle's men among them, arriving fast enough to save the walls if not the roof, before it could take the whole barn to the ground. Rose lay in the frost-hardened grass, with Nell clutched against her burned arm, both of them alive, both of them shaking, soot-blackened and coughing, and Caleb knelt over the two of them with a look on his face that had nothing practical left in it at all. Only a raw, unguarded terror giving way, slowly, to something that looked a great deal like love finally admitting itself out loud. The doctor who rode out from town to see to Rose's arm that night was a quiet, competent woman named Dr. Whitcomb, who had delivered half the children in the county and buried the other half's grandparents, and she worked by lamplight at the kitchen table, cleaning the burn with a gentleness that did not stop it from hurting, while Hattie held Nell in the next room and Caleb paced the length of the porch outside because he could not make himself sit still and watch. "It'll scar," the doctor said plainly, because she was not a woman who softened facts, but it'll heal clean if she rests it and lets it. Rose, pale and hollow-eyed with the shock only now catching up to her, managed something close to a smile. "I don't imagine I have much use for arms that look untroubled. Doctor, I've never trusted a soul who hadn't been marked by something." When the doctor had gone and Nell was finally asleep, worn thin by fear and smoke, Caleb sat by the bed they now shared and took Rose's uninjured hand in both of his, turning it over as though he were reading something written there. "You ran into a burning barn for my daughter," he said, low, "a girl who wasn't yours by blood. For a stranger's advertisement you answered because you needed a roof." Rose looked at him a long moment in the lamplight. "She stopped being a stranger's daughter a good while before that fire, Caleb. I don't rightly know when. Somewhere between the mending and the whistling through grass, I expect. It was the closest either of them had come, in all the months of their practical arrangement, to saying the word neither had yet let themselves reach for, and neither of them said it that night either. But something passed between their joined hands that did not need the word to be true. The truth came out 3 days later, carried not by Rose's own mouth, but by a letter that arrived on the same coach as a traveling preacher who had known the Hale family back in Ohio and who had, by coincidence or providence, been carrying correspondence for half the territory that season. The letter was from Clara, Rose's sister, and it had been written weeks before Vance ever rode west, as though some part of Clara had known the truth could not stay buried forever, and had wanted it out in the world regardless of what it cost her to send it. In it, Clara set down plainly what Rose had never spoken aloud to anyone in the territory, that the money accused of being stolen had in fact been money Rose herself had given her sister in secret, a means of escape from a marriage that had turned dangerous and then violent, and that Rose had let the town believe the worst of her rather than let Jacob Vance's cruelty become public knowledge and follow Clara wherever she tried to rebuild her life. Clara wrote of nights she had not spoken of even to her own minister, of a sister who had shown up at her door in the dark with money she could not spare and a plan already half-formed, of a debt she said she could never repay except by finally telling the truth to whoever needed to hear it. The preacher read the letter aloud in the front room, with Hattie, Caleb, and half a dozen neighbors present, because Caleb had insisted the truth be heard by exactly the people who had heard the lie, standing at the back of the room with his arms crossed and his jaw set until the last word was read. When the reading finished, there was a long silence in that room. The good kind. The kind that comes after something heavy has finally been set down and everyone in the room feels its absence at once. Mrs. Colby was the first to speak, and what she said was an apology, awkward and overdue, her hands twisting in her apron, and she said it looking Rose in the eye, which cost her something. And Rose, to her own quiet surprise, found she could accept it without bitterness, because she understood now what it was to carry a burden alone and how much lighter the world felt once it was finally shared. Warren Doyle, who had bet his water rights scheme on Rose's disgrace, said nothing at all in that room and did not trouble the Reeves fence line again, and within the year had sold his own outfit and moved on to try his luck elsewhere, the way men do when a scheme collapses out from under them. Hattie crossed the room and took Rose's bandaged arm in both her hands, careful of the burn, her eyes bright with something she did not bother hiding, and said only, "Sit at that table, daughter. You stayed through the hard season, and then some." And it was the same table, the same front room, where a rule had once been quietly laid down about strangers who did not last, and now that rule was just as quietly, and just as deliberately, retired. Spring came slow to that ridge, the way it always did, but it came. And it came to a house that no longer needed watching the way a wound needs watching. The rebuilt barn stood a little squarer than the old one, built with more hands helping than Caleb had ever expected to see gathered on his land again, neighbors who had believed a rumor now working alongside the woman the rumor had wronged, passing lumber and laughter back and forth in equal measure. Rose's arm healed to a scar she wore without hiding it, the same way she no longer hid much of anything in that house, and told Nell, when the girl asked about it, that some marks were worth keeping because of what they proved rather than what they cost. Nell had taken to following her everywhere with the devotion small girls save for the mothers who choose to stay rather than the mother's fate simply assigns, and had taken, too, to signing her schoolwork Nell Reeves with a small, deliberate flourish that made both her father and Rose smile whenever they caught sight of it. A year on, there was a new voice in that house learning to make its first sounds, a small one. And the sound of it did not make the old grief return the way Caleb had once feared it might, but seemed instead to settle in alongside it, the way new growth settles in beside an old scar on a tree that has, against every quiet fear Hattie had once carried, decided after all that it wanted to live. Caleb found himself, more evenings than not, standing in doorways again just to watch his wife do some ordinary thing, teaching Nell a new stitch, arguing gently with Hattie over a recipe, humming some half-remembered tune while she worked the new baby's basket in near the stove, and understanding, each time, that he had married a stranger to stop a house from going quiet. And what he had gotten instead was a woman who never once stopped surprising him, season after season, in ways no advertisement could have promised and no practical arrangement could have accounted for. She had turned out to be brave in a fire and gentle with a hawk's broken wing and stubborn as good rope and quicker with numbers than he was himself, and every single one of those things had come to him slowly, the way true knowledge of another person always does, one ordinary evening at a time. Hattie lived to see the baby christened, and stood godmother at the small gathering afterward, and told anyone who would listen, with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had been right about something that mattered, that she had known the very week Rose fixed that fence post without being asked, that the tree had decided to live. Clara wrote regularly now, her own letters no longer weighed down with things unsaid, and there was talk, some seasons on, of her making the long trip west herself to see the sister who had given up her own good name to buy her one final chance at safety. Warren Doyle's old spread changed hands twice more before anyone in the county troubled to learn the new owner's name, and Mrs. Colby, in her own quiet way, became one of the first women to bring a covered dish to the Reeves table each harvest, an apology repeated so many times over so many years that it eventually stopped needing to be called one at all. The advertisement Caleb had once placed in 3 Eastern newspapers was still folded, yellowing, in the bottom of the ledger drawer, and Rose found it there one spring while hunting for a receipt, and read it over with something between a laugh and a sigh, and left it exactly where it was, because a person does not throw away the paper that saved their whole life, even once the life it saved has outgrown every word written on it. If you had stood in that yard on a clear evening the following autumn, you would have heard laughter carrying clear across the pasture, a girl's and a woman's, and every so often a man's laugh too, rusty from disuse, but getting easier with practice, and you might have asked yourself, as I'll ask you now, how many of us have built walls out of old grief? Certain nothing new could ever be trusted to stand inside them, only to be proven gloriously, stubbornly wrong by someone who simply refused to leave when things got hard? If this story moved you, stay a while longer with us, dear friends. Like this video, subscribe for more stories of quiet courage and hard-won love, and tell us in the comments which moment stayed with you longest. We'll be here next time with another story worth the telling.